All right, Joe, we are back on the podcast where we are training men in spiritual fitness. And we've been spending the past few weeks talking about this idea of spiritual fitness, helping men understand what we've identified as 5 dimensions of spiritual fitness, just to try to put some meat on the bones of when we talk about, in general, men being spiritually fit. What does that exactly mean? So we've been talking to guys about things like clarity and captivation and competence, these pieces that I think are integral for being a spiritually fit man. And today we're going to continue with that by talking about a big one that we talk about a lot, Joe. In fact, if guys are regular listeners to the podcast, they've heard this subject kind of been talked in and around a lot, and that's self-control. That men need self-control. And I want to start us off a little differently this time, because I want guys to face directly some of the myths that they are believing about self-control. Some of the things I'm hearing guys say about self-control. And I think we need to attack those first before we even begin to define self-control and how guys can start to grow in it. So I'm going to throw at you a little bit of a myth that I've heard, and then let's see what you can do with it. See what you say about it. So let's start here. Self-control is unspiritual. This is what I hear guys sometimes say when they're talking about spiritual growth and the idea of self-control. Well, self-control is it's an unspiritual thing. That's a worldly thing that's out there. It has nothing to do with a spiritual life.
I mean, I definitely can appreciate where guys are coming from, because it does kind of have that sound. You just can picture, any number of podcasts about life management and talking about this. But the fundamental problem with that mindset or that myth is, if you look at the fruit of the Spirit, self-control is mentioned. Paul, he talks about, disciplining himself and self-control in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And so we may not like to hear it, because I think there's something in us, especially with, wanting to rely on the Spirit and lean into grace, that we would just love the Bible to say, look, you don't need to exert any self-control. This is just going to happen spontaneously without any effort. That's just not true, that the Spirit works in and through us. Mm-hmm. And so part of that fruit, again, it is self-control. So it is spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, here's another one. I hear guys a lot of times equate self-control with willpower. That's all self-control is, just having great willpower. What would you say to that?
I think if you just pause and think in terms of any area of your life where you feel like there is a degree of self-control. So rather than being on that raft and drifting with the current, that you really do feel like in some sense you've got the rudder and you're steering, you will find that the will is present. You're making choices. Yeah. But you're going to find that there's so much more that's involved in terms of, that direction. Like, you're going to realize that that your imagination is involved. That if you couldn't conceive of a future, like if you couldn't see something that was worth making a reality, then you wouldn't be going that direction. It's because you can see there's something good that's not yet present, but will come into being. You can think of, like, again, your memory. Throughout the Bible, God's telling us, to remember who he is, to remember that he will be with us. And we know that in order to move that direction, which requires faith, you're never going to steer into those deep waters unless you really have in your mind, and it's at the front of your mind, not the back of your mind, that God is with you in the midst of trials. And so if you basically just think of all of the different parts of the mind, which involves your intellect, and you've got your attention, and you've got your memory, and all of these things, they're all involved. And so self-control, it's not like a single piece of us, the will. Everything has to, in a sense, be thrown out there on the table. And the Spirit uses all of it in order to help get us to that place where, again, we've got the rudder and aren't just drifting.
All right. But that does lead well into another myth that I hear, because a lot of what you just said, and even in the title of self-control, involves self, right? So a lot of guys hear self-control and they think, well, that's self-reliance. That's all about me and self-reliance. So how would you attack that myth of self-control is just self-reliance?
I'll give guys a concrete situation. So picture the guy falls in love with this woman, wants to spend the rest of his life with this woman, and says, you know what? I'm just going to lean on myself, and I'm going to be faithful to you. Sickness and health, better or worse, I'm going to be there for you the rest of our life, and I'm just going to rely on myself for this to happen. The man who did that would be an absolute fool. because what the wise man realizes is that actually there's this thing called marriage. And when you commit to this external structure, there are moments when your internal willpower feels really weak.
Mm.
But if you're reminded of this covenant that's bigger than you, of these promises that you've made, this whole structure before God, this person outside of you, all of that extrinsic stuff is incredibly powerful to reinforce the weakness of the internal stuff.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
you're not, with self-control, we're not just relying on ourselves. This is where you want to build a lifestyle, you want to build networks of relationships, you want to make commitments and even promises. You want all of these things to be present so that you can continue to go in that direction that you want to go. And so to say self-control, it's not just relying upon self, it's doing all of the things that you know that God has given us to help us pursue godliness in life.
That's great. Here's the last one I'd throw at you is, and this is the one that drives me the most nuts, probably. Just that guys compare self-control to like having great hair. Like some guys have it, some guys don't, right? You either have great hair or you don't. You either have great self-control or, you just some guys just aren't born with it.
I think if we remember, let's go back to the fruit of the Spirit. You could take any of the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience. Take patience. I mean, what man would say, some guys are patient, some guys aren't. I just can't do anything about my temper. If I get angry, that's just who I am. And that other guy, man, he's amazing because God's given him such patience. Now, when it comes to something like patience, we realize that the Spirit wants us to grow. In a sense, every time we say no to just, flipping the switch and getting angry and say yes to being slow-tempered, that, in some way that gets a little bit further embedded in our character. And so what we need to have is just that growth mindset of recognizing, as long as you have the Spirit, which every Christian has, as long as you have the Spirit within your heart, operating within your life, that a self-control is something that can continue to, take root and blossom. And so there's no reason, no matter how much you failed in the past, we're in Christ. We got all the hope in the world. And
Yes.
so look at the horizon and think, I could become a man that really has self-control because of the grace of God and the work of the Spirit in my life.
Yeah, there's no getting out of it, right? There's no getting out of this pursuit of growth and self-control. So that's good. All right. So then help me better identify exactly what self-control is, because you have, in attacking those myths, kind of expanded self-control in a way that perhaps most guys aren't used to thinking about it. So can you give us a clear definition of self-control when we're thinking about it in terms of spiritual fitness? Because again, our aim is to help guys to be able to train in godliness day in and day out, to be a man who is spiritually fit. And one of those dimensions is this idea of self-control. So what do we mean when we tell guys that in the concept of self-control?
Yeah. I always like to start with what something's not and then think about a clear definition of what it is.
Good. All right.
And so, start with the guy who very clearly is just letting life lead him. And that could be any number of things. I mean, it could just be he's exhausted, that he's never planned. He's just drifting with the current, that he's distracted all the time. So all of these things. I mean, it's very easy to look out and think that person, I mean, he is just conforming to his environment. So we know self-control is not that.
Yeah.
So you push that off the table and you ask, well, what is it? And I wrote down a definition, and here's what it is. That self-control is using all the internal and external resources that God has given us to steer our lives in the direction of godliness. Okay. And so again, to look both, our own persons. So what are the kind of faculties God has given us that if we cultivate these things, they can assist us? And then again, what are the things outside of us? And so, if you're starting, we've already listed several of these, but self-control, well, you're going to have to think about training your memory. If you're going to steer your life, again, you can't forget the promises of God. You're going to have to sharpen your intellect. You're going to have to be able to identify the threats in a modern environment that, again, want to hijack your life. You're going to have to think about, again, your attention. If we're not paying attention to spiritual truths, if we're just allowing ourselves in our mind to be filled with all the lies of this world, it's going to take a toll on this. You have to think about your will as well. You're going to have to make those choices that are godly and to say no to the things that are ungodly. And so all of these things, you have to imagine self-control being the end result of a bunch of different muscle groups.
Yeah.
Not a single muscle. It's everything. It's all, kind of a soul exercise. And as you strengthen each of these things, the end result is you've got a little bit more self-control. But again, that's the outside. Then or the inside, you got to think about the outside. Again, how do you set yourself up in terms of your environment and your relationships so these things assist you in this direction? And so, we often talk, well, who are your friends? What is your lifestyle? What are your daily routines? That all of these things, they strengthen that self-control. They can also weaken that self-control.
Yeah, I think that one thing guys need to think through, as I'm hearing you kind of define their self-control, I'm hearing the opposite of what a lot of guys, where their starting point with self-control. A lot of guys' starting point is, well, self-control is all about saying no. And I think that's true, right? That self-control means that there are certain things we must say no to, but you're pitching a vision of a greater yes that we're aiming for, right? That self-control is, yes, it's about saying no to certain things, but there's also this idea, obviously within spiritual fitness training, we are training for something. Therefore, we're saying a greater yes to something. And that self-control is, what are the yeses that are going to lead me on this pilgrimage and this journey? And so it's, because a lot of times we look at self-control and it's like, how do we steal our joy, right? How do we just so much self-denial that we're miserable? That's not at all what you're talking about, though. It doesn't sound like.
Yeah, no, I think, picture the person that really wants to get in shape. And they want to do so because they know they'd feel better. They'd be able to enjoy their kids more. It's a positive vision. But then again, you think of all that it would take in terms of if they really want to do this. And, they're going to have to first, again, have that compelling image in their mind. People often talk about that, really seeing a future you that is exciting. They're going to think about people they could be around. What friends could they, put themselves around that also want to get in shape. They're going to put their shoes out and, their workout clothes, outside. So they step up and it's the first thing they see in the morning. They're going to get up early so they can get to the gym before work. And there's a whole set of things that are necessary to get them in that place where their life is moving in the direction of becoming a person more fit. And I mean, it's the same thing with godliness. All of those little things, when Paul's saying, make no provision for the flesh, I mean, set yourself up, so that you can really pursue godliness. And so we need a big vision of self-control, and we've got to get beyond that little understanding of, it's just no, and it's just a killjoy,
right?
And all the rest of the lies Satan would tell us.
Yeah. And there is something that, okay, if you begin to live in that way, that guys will notice, they will be accused of. But I want to kind of break it down a little bit. A lot of times when you start to live this sort of disciplined life and aim at self-control, you'll be accused of legalism in some sense, right? A lot of times when you start talking self-control, people bring up, isn't that just legalistic? And I don't think that really, honestly, I don't think I've ever had anyone talk to me about that, where they actually meant that, where they thought, oh, Evan, you're doing these things to try to earn salvation. I don't think that's what they meant. Really what they meant is, Evan, you're trying too hard.
That's right.
Right. And so I think guys have to be okay with that. Like, okay, you are trying too hard in this effort toward godliness. Be that kind of guy, be okay with being accused of trying too hard, right? But that's got to be, it comes with the territory.
I mean, who really thinks that it's going to be an easy thing to become a man of prayer in the 21st century?
No,
that's not down. It's never been downhill, but maybe it's a little bit more steeply uphill than it's been before. So we got to just expect, it's going to take some sweat of the brow. But that's okay. It's worth it.
It's part of it. All right. So help guys understand why it is that self-control is so important. We've made this one of our 5 dimensions of spiritual fitness. Why is this important for the Christian man?
And I think what we're just talking about, I mean, all the things that we're up against as men, that this is something that we're never going to persevere. We're never going to endure without. I think a couple of verses, guys will probably know these verses. They're often quoted, but I'm just going to read them. This is Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and at the right hand is at the right hand of the throne of God.
Mm.
Take those two verses. Think of how many elements um, that you see where self-control is going to be vital. It talks about being surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. That's telling you that we should be looking to a certain audience. That's not our natural audience. The cloud of witnesses we tend to pay attention to are the colleagues at work. So, we've got to deliberately be exerting our attention in a particular direction.
Mm.
We've got to lay aside weights. That means shifting our lifestyle, our environment, so that, and again, we're set up for discipleship. That doesn't happen by itself. Talks about sin that clings closely. Sin doesn't get taken off by itself.
Mm.
There's a lot of, self-control that is required to put off sin. Running with endurance,
Mm.
again, obvious self-control. Looking to Jesus, again, we've got to direct our attention. Jesus, he endured the cross. He despised the shame. We've got to get a whole different framework for what counts as losing in the world versus really, what honor is worth achieving. All of this is a picture of a radically different existence in the world than what's natural and comfortable and normal. And so if we're not having this self-control, all that is in these two verses, it's just not going to happen spontaneously. So we need this. We need this
Yes.
if we're really going to run this race as the Bible tells us to run it.
I'm so glad you used those verses, because just in hearing you and hearing the verbs you used that are used in those verses, it's so much different. It's a different vision of what self-control is pictured in the minds of most guys. Honestly, I think if you ask guys to draw a picture of a self-controlled man, what they do is they draw a picture of a stoic statue. Like, that's self-control, right? But it has to be a statue, because you can't go anywhere. It's like this guy who's just stoically standing in the midst of anything and everything. But that's so much different than the verses you just read. That's so much different. Because you're talking about, yes, running a race, and there's all kind. This is not a static life, and the life of a self-controlled man is not static and standing on the sidelines. But so I want to help guys get there, though. Like, how do we begin to do this? How do we begin to grow in self-control?
Yeah, I would point guys to the two preceding episodes in this podcast series, captivation and clarity. If guys have listened to those two episodes, they're going to see that feeds right into this. I mean, your heart has to be captivated by a compelling vision of something, glorious and good that you want. It's not going to be easy to attain, but it'll be worthwhile. So, I mean, that captivation is going to be critical for the motivation you need to keep running, but equally the clarity, to really have a clear sense, what are the obstacles? If I'm not strategically thinking about how to set up the board of my life, I'm going to find myself vulnerable, and I'm going to end up, tripping over my feet, having this extra weight rather than the simplicity of knowing that there's one thing that's needed. So I'd think about captivation, think about clarity. That's the really deep stuff. There's also the more surface stuff, the choices, but you got to start at that deeper level.
Yeah, I'm gonna push on you a little bit there, because gosh, it's so where you go every time, Joe. And I'm so like the practical, like, because here I am, I'm thinking, all right, Joe, give me some examples of self-control for the life of a Christian man. What is an example? And I want you to give me like hard line. And you just said, like, think about clarity and think about, I don't know. So what would you double down there and say, if I asked you for examples of self-control for the guy that's out there listening, saying, I want to grow in this, and he's just looking for a list of things to begin to do today, where do you guide him?
Yeah, you're going to have to start thinking about your life from different points of elevation, or from different kind of horizons, different distances. So, you're thinking about self-control, yes, moment by moment. It is that choice that you make when you're confronted with a decision and thinking, well, which course is the godly one? And that's happening all the time. And often that's a matter of decisions you've already made. And that's where you've got to get to a higher level of elevation. Most days you follow your routines. So if you're going to exert self-control, you've got to think of patterns of behavior that become second nature, so that even if you've not made that choice, you have made in the sense that it's become the thing that you just habitually do. You wake up in the morning a little bit early, and you know exactly, this is where I am in my Bible, and you open it up, and this is how you go about meditating on God's word. That's how you feed your soul, so you have strength later on for those surface decisions.
Mm.
But then you got to think even at a whole nother level, you've got to get to that really high elevation point where the purpose of your life is to pursue God and pursue godliness.
Mm.
If you're not starting at that high level, you will drift.
Yeah.
And so this is where you've got to think of self-control. Again, we're talking about in the moment, we're talking about it in the week, we're
Yeah.
talking about when you gather up life as a whole,
Yeah.
all of these things. So when the nuts and bolts, it's kind of godly life planning. Is what we've talked
Yeah.
about, in other episodes, but
Yeah.
you've got to be that person that plans in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's key. And I think about, just as a way to kind of wrap it up, we talk about doing these kind of things, not in isolation, but as groups of men. So how do groups of men begin to identify and train in stuff like self-control? And I think often we would say, let's talk about self-control with each other. Like, okay, be able to talk with your friends about where you need self-control in your life, and ask for accountability, and maybe have those higher elevation talks with your friends. And I think that's good. But one twist I just kind of offer in that, and it just would maybe take a little more boldness from you, but I'd say ask your friends, hey, where do I need self-control in my life? It's one thing to say, hey, here's where I think I need self-control. It's another thing to point it at someone else and say, hey, where do you think that I need self-control? Or to look at your friend and look them in the eyes and say, hey, I think you need to pursue self-control in this way. That creates different kind of conversations. And for a lot of guys, I know what you're thinking. You're hearing that and you're like, I don't even have a friend or a group of friends who I could have that kind of conversation with, who know me so well that they could be able to speak into my life on where I need self-control and how I can begin to pursue it. Well, good news. Next week, we're talking about camaraderie. That's another portion of spiritual fitness and being a spiritually fit man. We want you to have these kind of groups of friends. So I hope you will join us next week, because we're going to look at what does it look like to have a group of friends like that you can have those kind of conversations with. So if you already have a group like that, man, that's great. Y'all begin to talk about self-control this week. But if not, man, join us next week. We're going to talk about camaraderie, this last piece, this last dimension of spiritual fitness.